ratios to GDP, but let us look at our exports in the context of what we are going to repay outside. Are we earning more? The reality is, Walter, that in the last few months or several months, the remittances from the Kenyans in the diaspora have actually exceeded our exports. That is not a very good thing to hang on to. So as we continue to look at what we are doing, look at the public expenditure side, look at what we have to spend, have we made the right commitments? Are we being too ambitious?
Okay, we seem to have lost Honorable Mudavadi.
Albert was the only one losing him.
Let's see if we can find him. But as he's sorting out his technical issues, perhaps I'll just throw a question to the panel. This is from Stephen Lagat from Eldoret. Perhaps Honorable Kimunya, before you come in, not to preempt your presentation, but Stephen asks, is our debt sustainable?
Yes, it is. And probably when I go through my presentation, he'll realize it is.
Okay.
Yeah, Kenya is one of the countries that has never defaulted on any of its debt obligations.
Right. Perhaps I'll pose the same question to Dr. Ndi. Again, not to preempt what we'll be presenting later, but kindly unmute, sir.
I don't want to get into arguments, but Kenya has defaulted several times. The way we default is by building arrears. We don't repay, but because we were largely sort of building arrears of bilateral debt, they don't make much noise about it. So you will see we've done a couple of Paris Club reschedulings in the past. So the case that we've never really had debt repayment issues is absolutely not true. We have rescheduled debt quite a few times. As to the question of sustainability, I was going to make that point. I mean, there are rules of thumb about sustainability of debt, and you use two key rules of thumb. You're going to pay your debt out of your revenue, and particularly your interest. Therefore, your interest cost should not grow faster than your revenue for too long. Throughout Jubilee, interest cost has been growing at twice the rate of revenue. The other one is that your foreign debt, because you're going to pay from your foreign exchange, if you're borrowing foreign debt, you should be looking at commensurate earnings in foreign exchange. Mudavadi already said that our foreign debt has been going up and our export earnings have been going down. So if you use those two simple indicators, it tells you that you are headed towards your revenue, all sort of quite a big chunk of your revenue going to interest, and also quite a lot of your foreign exchange going to debt instead of imports. So what happens is that you can continue paying your debt, but part of what you are paying it with is lives of people, because you are paying for it with the money that should have gone into healthcare. And because we don't have sort of people who are dying from lack of healthcare in our balance sheet, you might be saying that your debt is sustainable, but that's because you have squeezed all the other payments, all the other expenses which are important out of the budget. They've been crowded out by debt service.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Honorable Musalia Mudavadi, sorry we lost you. Kindly go on, sir.
I think I'm back. I don't know where you lost me, but I was just saying, I think I got a bit of Dr. Ndi mentioning the issue of the exports, which have been declining. We've not seen the kind of growth that would give us that comfort. But in conclusion, I just wanted to say that what is critical, and I'll repeat this, is our ability to pay. And you had asked me what it was like when I was Minister for Finance, and subsequently then there was the Kibaki government, and now we are in the Jubilee government, Uhuru's government. And I had stated very clearly that we will have to borrow, no doubt about it, but it is our capacity to repay. And the biggest danger is that now we are seeing more of the inflows coming in from Kenyans in the diaspora, as opposed to seeing the kind of growth we would want to see from our exports. So that ratio, the ratio of our exports vis-a-vis our debt is something that we need to look at, particularly when we are talking in the context of external debt. That is absolutely critical. But going forward, we will have to rely heavily on Parliament to revisit this issue around debt, so that they can help us to balance between our public expenditure programs and what we are able to handle, either in the form of revenue generated locally, ordinary revenues, and also to what extent do we balance it with the external support would be getting in the form of loans or grants and so forth. Now, this is critical, and I was saying that we cannot run away from this anymore, because the taxpayer in Kenya is feeling the pinch. I can tell you that a lot of the panelists who are here maybe have got a lot of visitation from the taxman, maybe 3 or 4 times, visiting you and expecting you to make your returns and challenging every other return that you make. So we are reaching a stage where the taxman is literally now beginning to zero in on the same guys again and again and again. On paper, we talk about broadening the tax base for purposes of revenue collection and so forth. But in reality, the people who are carrying the burden are shrinking. Now, this to me is something that we need to look at very critically if we are going to manage our debt going forward.
All right, thank you so much, Honorable Musalia Mudavadi. We will have a few questions for you. I think we'll take them at the end during the question and answer session. I want to bring in Honorable Kimunya. Honorable Kimunya, you saw from Angela's presentation that there's a lot of anxiety. People are unhappy about the current situation. But the feeling is that government does not believe that we are, in a crisis. So perhaps you could take the next 10 minutes or so and, demystify this issue of public debt management in Kenya and tell us what is fact and what is reality. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Walter. I think the first thing we need to think of it, and I'll look at it from both an academic point of view and from a practical point of view, and from my own experience, both in government and in parliament, and as a borrower myself. So when we're talking about public debt management, I think the first thing we need to ask ourselves is what exactly are we talking about, so that we don't behave like the Kenyans who will answer to Angela based on what they've read from in the social media, or what they've been made to believe by the talks on the radio shows and politicians in funerals and all that. Public debt, when we're looking at public debt, I think the first thing we need to all agree is we're talking about getting that kind of money we need to finance whatever cannot be collected from taxes, because we only have 2 sources of revenue, either what we get in taxation, and the balance can only come from debt and grants, if we are lucky to get anything by way of grants from somebody. So, but we have funding needs, every year, and it has to be paid for by somebody somewhere. The other objective of, really what we call prudent debt management would obviously have to be how do we achieve low cost and risk and low risk objectives. And when you're talking of low cost, it's not just the interest rates, because I think we get carried away by just thinking of the interest rate as the only factor. When you're talking of the cost of debt, is the interest rate is only a factor, but if you're going to get some delay in project implementation or project starting as you are negotiating a low interest debt, right? Then you're actually going to pay a huge debt in the longer term. And I want to give you a typical example. When I was in the Treasury, and I believe Honorable Salia will confirm this, you would end up negotiating World Bank loans, IMF loans, Japanese grant loans. Almost from the time the project is conceptualized, it will take like 5 years before the project actually takes off. Now, in between, when you started negotiating a $1 billion project, by the time the project is beginning, the costs have escalated to probably like $2 billion. So you might get it at the 2% or the 1%, but you pay an extra $1 billion due to the inflation and the project delay costs. Now, when you then look at the overall cost of debt based on, what you would have paid at 5%, be it a commercial debt, but you get a project today and waiting for the project 5 years down the line and you pay 1%, the overall cost, again, vis-a-vis when you also reap the benefits of that cost, then it becomes like it's not cost effective. So when you're looking at the cost of debt and what you need to manage is you need to factor those in terms of what is the interest rates and vis-a-vis also the timeline between actually securing that debt. The other item we also need to start thinking of is debt management also involves, there's some other targets that will need to be factored in. There is the monetary policy objectives that are impacted, and whatever you do, you don't want to mess up that. And obviously, they need to develop an efficient market for securities and debt, and which the government is a major player. If the government was not trading in the TBs and all that, you will not be getting those treasury bills in the financial markets. So there's a bigger issue to look at, not just that we're borrowing from China or somewhere. Now, let me go to some specifics that, and I think I'm happy that some of you have already been raised. That one, debt is not evil. We have brought out into this debate as if it's so bad. And that's why most Kenyans are saying they don't want debt. They don't want foreign debt. But they don't know that every week, the Kenyan government is actually borrowing through the treasury bills so much money. But have you ever heard any Kenyan talking about we should stop borrowing on the treasury bills, or we should stop borrowing on the treasury bonds? Because they don't even know about it. They don't understand it. And the social media does not talk about it. We only talk about IMF debt. We only talk about external debt. We only talk about the Chinese debt. Yet over half 50% of our debt is actually domestic, which is what we should be worried about because it crowds out the private sector. And I know Phyllis and company will probably be talking about that. The other thing is we need to agree on is that debt is a major enabler for investment. Whether you're looking at the public sector, whether you're looking at the private sector, the corporate sector, even at the personal level. We all took loans at the university to study, right? I've never heard anyone saying that HELB should stop giving student loans because they don't have jobs and hence they have no capacity to pay. Are HELB loans sustainable, right? You're taking it in the expectation that your life will get better and in future you'll be able to get a better job. And because your parents can't pay, somebody has to finance the money. So even at a very personal level, debt is desirable. When young chaps living in university, I would be encouraging them to take a mortgage if on the first employment, so they can start getting into a decent house, getting into a decent car upfront. That happens in the US. So debt is not bad per se. It's what you actually do with it that matters. I think the other thing that we need to also think of is in all these discussions, you kind of hear that we don't have a legal framework. Our constitution is very clear. And I think in Article 201, for example, it brings in the issue of, even the sharing of the burden and the benefits between the current and future generations. There should be some equity in that. It also imposes in Article 211 some, deadlines in terms of when government must account to Parliament. And I'll come to that later on. And also within our, Public Financial Management Act of 2012, again, we have a legal framework. But, when Kenyans are talking about that, it's like it's being debated out there. There's no framework for management. There's no legal framework for oversighting this debt. We also have an institutional framework. We have a debt office created through the PFM Act. I mean, it's not just some small office in the Treasury managing all this. It's a legally established institutional framework. I know, Sakwa is even proposing to have a debt oversight authority, and we will have that discussion in Parliament. But my own feeling is that we seem to run away from not interrogating the institutional frameworks that are already in place to creating other, and that's why you have a plethora of parastatals and all the institutions that have been created over time. Because instead of looking at, is the one we have currently working, what can we do to make it better? We end up saying, let's create another authority, let's create another commission. And you end up with all those things. We have 15 commissions in the, or upwards of so many commissions in the Constitution. What are they actually doing? How are they helping in our situation? But we have a debt office. We also have our central bank, which is really the organization that handles that. Now, I know it's a short time. Now, on accountability, Article 201, PFM Section 31, PFM Section 33 have set up some mandatory reporting by Treasury to Parliament. And I can tell you that much as people say there's opacity in the management of debt, I tabled a report just on last week, on the 6th of the debt situation for the period ending 31st of March. That is just about, for the first quarter of this year. It's in Parliament. And even within the document that came with the budget estimates is a whole, the debt management strategy. But we don't want to interrogate those because it's more hard work. It's easier to read in the social media. Now, the last item I want to mention, because so I get out of that, is this issue of what is a desirable debt to GDP ratio. And you all recall that I think it was IMF that had prescribed this, that there's a whole issue of that for developed countries, the desirable ratio is 60%, and for the developing countries, is 40%. But I think in January of this year, one of the top economists who worked for the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, gave a lecture in the Ashoka in a seminar, and I might just quote for you what he said about these limits, because he rubbished the existence of these limits. I think the first thing was his issue was policymakers, both in the rich and poor world, and I'm quoting, should ask themselves two hard questions. How high might interest rates rise relative to growth rates in a plausible stress case because of all this COVID and the downturn in the economy? And how tight a budget would be politically possible in response? Because it's bringing in extra demands, public investments to mitigate COVID issues, to mitigate the low performance in economies. And the answers give a rough indication of the debt ratio a country can comfortably expect to sustain. But he goes further and puts it in terms of the 60 and 40, that these were nonsensical numbers, but the inequality was right. Now, if you want to get more of that, if you can grab a copy of The Economist of the 11th of February, that article is there, and there's been several blogs by IMF on similar topic in terms of, this issue of people saying, should developing countries borrow more or stop borrowing and stop spending and let their people die because they can't borrow money to provide for COVID mitigation. They cannot, provide money to mitigate against the economic downtowns. They stop development because the economy is not performing, so they have no money for taxes. Or should they actually now be spending more, stimulate the economies, which is exactly what the developing countries are doing. That's what America is doing. That's what Britain is doing. That's what the European Union countries are doing. And I think that's perhaps what we need to look at, rather than just bottle ourselves into this feeling that we can't borrow more. We need to develop this country. Now, the last item I just want to mention, and it's in a way a response to
2 more minutes.
To the issue. Yes, thanks. To the issue of matching our foreign debt with our exports. What do we have within our export mix? We have agriculture. I think horticulture and basically agriculture are the main products we actually export out there. Then within at the regional level, we obviously get dollars and foreign currency through our regional trade. It's also been going down because our neighbors are not exactly performing as well as they should. We're not endowed with the minerals and all that Tanzania and Congo have. We have our tourism. When you are looking at the other services, that's a major income generator. But there's a service that we keep ignoring, and I like the comparison Musalia did by saying we're getting more money from our diaspora. I look at diaspora. This is earnings we are getting from the export of our services. These are Kenyans who have been trained in Kenya by Kenyans. We have exported them out there. They're working for the world and remitting money back. This is money coming from exported services. And until we recognize that, in 2007 and 2006, December 2007, about March, I actually went around the world, in Europe, in US, tried formalizing all these remittances that Kenyans are bringing, so that they were not just coming, chini ya maji, undercover. To make it formal, went out there with the banks to register the Kenyans in the US, to register the Kenyans in UK. And you look at even the spike, the trend of diaspora remittances, you will see a huge spike just around that period, because when people knew it was formal to bring this money back, and it will be accounted for and regarded as part of Kenyan export of services, of intellectual services, manpower services, then people are comfortable to bring this money back. So when we're looking at exports, we need to add diaspora as part of our export earnings, right? Then obviously with and other countries like Philippines and all that have done quite well on that. It's such a short time. I would like to do much more, but we can take that within the Q&A. But I would like to just say, I know Dr. Ndei did mention that we've defaulted, we've delayed in and restructured our debt. Every Kenyan did that last year. Does not mean they're defaulted. And when I was in Treasury, one of my happiest moments is when Kenya was called upon to contribute to a kitty by IMF that was being used to bail out countries that were in the highly indebted countries, the hippie countries. And we did that. And we were probably apart from South Africa and Kenya, we were about the only 2 African countries that did not default. And we held our honor and integrity and are so proud, saying we are going to contribute to this kitty to bail out these countries that are defaulted with their debt. And those are the countries that condescending video was talking about. I don't like it, but he should perhaps be addressing the countries in the Greece of this world, the Spain, the Poland, and other EU countries that are defaulting and have to be bailed out by the European Investment Bank. Thanks. Let me put it at that, and we will engage further. I hope I put things in perspective. Mine was to demystify, put some facts, and then we will now discuss based on the facts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable Kimunya. I see your presentation has generated quite a lot of discussion. We'll come to that at the Q&A session.
Thank you.
I'll quickly move to Honorable Opio Wandai. Sir, Parliament is the first debt manager in Kenya, which is to say, the management of debt in this country actually lies squarely with Parliament. Kindly tell us, in your estimation, sir, Is our debt management really that bad? And if so, how did we get here? And really, what is the role of Parliament in the oversight of public expenditure? Honorable Opiowandai.
Okay, sorry, I'm back. Yes, thank you very much, Walter. I'll try to take as short time as possible, since a lot of ground actually has been covered by Honorable Musali and Honorable Amos. And I will be looking at basically at the role of the National Assembly in budget making. I don't think we need the slides. Just remove them, because I will. Yeah. I'll be looking at the role of the National Assembly in the budget making process and oversight of public expenditure, of course, from the perspective of a legislator. Okay. And as I do so, it is important to share with you that within the public debt management, public debt and borrowing policy, okay, there's a draft policy known as public debt and borrowing policy. I'm calling it draft because it was unveiled, I think, in June 2020, and it still sits at the National Treasury. It has not yet come to Parliament, okay? And we know under the Statutory Instruments Act, yeah, for such a policy to have a force of law, it needs to be approved by Parliament. So I'll refer to it as a draft. So under that draft policy, government may borrow, of course, or guarantee debt for any of the following 7 purposes. One is financing government budget deficits, honoring obligations under national government guarantees, refinancing and pre-financing existing debts, cash management, mitigating against adverse effects caused by an urgent or unforeseen events, enhancing official foreign exchange position, and meeting any other development policy objectives. Now, you know, when budget is being prepared in Parliament or is being made by Parliament, borrowing or debt is implied. And why do I say so? When, for instance, you are unveiling a budget of 3 trillion Kenya shillings, and yet the country can hardly collect 2 billion shillings in terms of revenue, then it means, in short, that you have to borrow to bridge the gap, yeah, in layman terms. So then how does Parliament come in? Parliament comes in 4 facets, okay, within the cycle. One is at policy planning and budget formulation stage, okay? And this is where Parliament, and in this case, I'm referring to National Assembly, reviews the budget review and outlook paper, and also approves the budget policy statement, which is a requirement by the Constitution. The second facet is budget approvals and legislation, okay? And here the National Assembly reviews the program-based budget, estimates and approves the budget report. The fourth facet is budget execution. And here the National Assembly plays the oversight role through its committees. These are mostly departmental committees, okay? Sorry, yeah, I didn't know I was not visible, okay? The third facet is auditing, evaluation, and reporting, okay? And here the National Assembly does the scrutiny of audit reports and a review of budget performance reports. And this is the role that is largely played by the main financial accounting committees, such as the Public Accounts Committee, which I chair in the National Assembly. And lastly is, that's the fourth one actually. So in undertaking this mandate, the National Assembly has been able to actually try its best if I talk about my own committee, the Public Accounts Committee, which I chair, to, from time to time, make recommendations to the public through the plenary on what needs to be done. And if you look at the 2016-2017 report of the Public Accounts Committee, and the latest one, which is 2017-2018, a number of recommendations have been made by my committee in order to enhance public debt management, specifically, and of course to improve the performance of the economy in general. And one of these recommendations is that this draft public debt policy, which I've said is lying at National Treasury, should be brought to Parliament, for debate and approval, so that it can have the requisite force of law. Okay, because it will be very key in managing risks and costs associated with public borrowing. Secondly, we have proposed an amendment to the PFM Act of 2012. Indeed, as we speak, amendment bill is in the process within the Parliament to make it mandatory for the National Treasury to seek and get approval of the National Assembly before entering into any deals or loaning agreements with other parties, loan agreements that exceed 1 billion Kenya shillings. As we speak, currently, there's no that obligation on the part of the National Treasury. Once Parliament has approved a debt ceiling, the National Treasury has what I would call like carte blanche to go about to procuring debts on behalf of the public. Now, Parliament needs to play a role in this, okay? Okay. The Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury and Planning, okay, should also form a national task force on public debt and engage an independent audit consultant to audit the National Debt Register and report to Parliament, because as you have clearly understood from various speakers here and elsewhere, there's even a debate as to how much really is the public debt as we speak. Yes, so that needs to be established. Okay, then the National Treasury should also put in place a realistic public expenditure plan with a view to reducing budget deficit, okay, and the attendant borrowing and accumulation of public debts. There's also, of course, the need for Parliament to pay particular attention to projects that are being financed through public borrowing or public debt, so that we can minimize wastage, yes, and pilferage, for that matter, for the public to get a value for its money. Okay, our wish is that if this happened, then we would have perhaps a more robust management of public debt for the betterment of our economy and the general well-being of the public and the Kenyan people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Honorable. That was Honorable James Opiyo Wandayi, Member of Parliament for Gunja, and current chair of the Public Accounts Committee. Again, sir, I think we will just handle all the comments that are coming through in the Q&A. I quickly want to jump to Honorable Sakwa Bunyasi, the current Member of Parliament for Nambale. Honorable Bunyasi previously held senior positions at the Agricultural Finance Corporation, the African Development Bank, and the World Bank. Critically, as you might have heard from our previous speakers, he's a sponsor of the Public Debt Management Authority Bill 2020. So, Honorable Bunyasi, perhaps you could put into context for us. What are good loans and what are bad loans? And then what is then the insight of how international lending works? And is a public debt management authority really the answer? Honorable Bunyasi. Honorable Bunyasi? Okay, we seem to have lost Honorable Bunyasi. Well, perhaps as we are trying to reach him, perhaps I'll bring in Dr. McPhee just to give us some insight or his thoughts on, what some of the things that the speakers have said, oh, okay, there we are. We have Honorable Bunyasi. Honorable Bunyasi, please turn on your video if you're able to, and your audio.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, but we cannot see you. Oh, there you are. Okay, perhaps we'll just have the audio. But Honorable Bunyasi, we just wanted to get your insight as to the definition of good loans, the definition of bad loans, and how international lending works. And then perhaps you could tell us, is a public debt management authority really what the country needs right now?
Yeah. Sorry, communication is a little sporadic, it's cutting, but I think I get the gist of what you're asking. We are proposing this improve and streamline the debt chain. The debt chain begins with projects that enter the pipeline, particularly largely because we are financing a lot of our development based on debt. But also more importantly, it's in the expectation, as has been explained, I think by Honorable Kimunya, Honorable Musalia and others, it's incurred in expectation of the benefits arising from it exceeding the quantum of debt in real terms. But normally those become a mismatch if the projects are ill-conceived, if they are pampered too much, that the costs are much higher than they should be. So essentially, you're incurring monies that cannot be recovered from benefits of the investment. And also, if the internal wastage through corruption of the investment that will be benefits. And generally speaking, it intends to deal with, to manage the borrowing. I listened to Honorable Kimunya quoting that former IMF economist, but there is some extremism in liberal economic thinking. So practice is still way behind the thoughts that the author of that article had. Maybe 10 years from now, we shall have made it mainstream. So what we are trying to do in Kenya is to remove the analytics of the required borrowings from the direct control of Treasury, have them accept this as a given from analysis done by perhaps mostly our own, and we have a large number of very, very good economists who can benefit from other international input, have them suggest what appropriate level should be, and have the Treasury accept that and deal with for a stable macroeconomic environment and for sustained growth that is not going to suffer hiccups. Disruption in the financing of essential services that underpin long-term growth also. For example, you get to a point where debt service competing with the ability to finance your health expenditure, your education expenditure, sustained perhaps food security, and at some stage it can also be security overall. So it's to, if you give the example of a clinical example, you are in a state, we have been and we are still in a state in which we're heading head on into a diabetic condition, But for the moment, the doctors are saying that your insulin levels are high and rising. And if you ignore it, you'll fall straight into a diabetic condition, and then you have to deal with the even greater complications that arise from it. We aren't in the diabetic stage yet, but I think we are pretty close at about debt service being about almost 2/3, I think 62%. But the numbers got vary a bit of our revenue collection goes into debt payment. It means therefore that we really have very little headroom and we can't do as much as we could do. And what we are proposing is not just another parastatal. No, we are proposing a facilitative think tank, and we're also proposing a system of checks that would ensure that what enters the pipeline does truly lead to higher benefits than the amount of debt incurred to create those benefits. And if you use that, of course, over time, then it's not so much the stock of debt that will matter, but the debt service levels, because probably the stock of debt will be relatively high quality that will produce the kinds of benefits to the economy as we see in those examples you have quoted, Japan having 237% debt to GDP. But remember that in Japan, GDP is about half of the GNP. The gross national product of Japan is about twice the GDP, meaning that as much income is generated overseas as is generated domestically in Japan. And in that case, the composition of the gross national product or GDP is a highly monetized one. Is you could say the entire economy is almost an export-oriented. It's not the entire, but a very large proportion, probably over 80%, is an export-oriented type of production. So debt servicing is not like what we face, where we have near panic each time that a loan is due, because you have to get the money, put the money together, that kind of thing. So I don't think that we should say that we are okay, therefore let's just continue. What we are trying to do in this bill is to say that we have done well, but that we should sustain that and do better. That we now have the capacity to, like we did, for example, back in the 70s, for those who are old enough then, we had a very tight system of planning, and the projects that entered the pipeline, the long-term, medium, long-term projects entered, had been assessed to have the rate of return exceeding the cost of the loan. But now, see, that culture has sort of eased off. I think it eased off because project type thinking has reduced in favor of program one, which is somewhat diffused because measurement of policy instruments is not as easily quantitative as it was when the thinking was largely project related. And then we have Parliament. I know my colleague, Chairman of Public Accounts Committee, has spoken about it, but the way that and I think Honorable Kimunya did, but the way in which we control, we deal with our oversight over debt is indirect. You are caught up in the process of approving a budget. The executive will argue that we are at a point in which we must spend this to be able to to be able to finance our services and so on. And in that, sometimes sort of party-based hysteria to pass what the party has proposed, Parliament has not, therefore, in that process, does not keep a tight eye on the deficit. Yeah. Are we together?
2 minutes.
Yeah. Parliament only does very direct control, and it's not based on a dedicated discussion on what the budget deficit levels should be, on what kind of shortfall in revenue, the revenue we can tolerate relative to the budget that we have proposed. And what the bill is saying, we should get a specific discussion of that shortfall, of that deficit. We even had abandoned in 2016 thereabouts measurement of our public debt levels as relative as a proportion of GDP. We said let's just look at absolute numbers, and that has the debt ceiling one that we set when we went to 9 trillion, for example. We were not even looking at its relativity to GDP because it was so high. Then our GDP was about 11 trillion, and we are moving our debt ceiling to 9. And everybody said, well, we shan't have to use it. It will be around, we shall use it until about 2023, 2024. But here we are in 2021, and we are pretty close to it by some estimates. Some estimates give our debt level at about 8 point something trillion, not 7.2 trillion. But those numbers again, aren't accurate because even our ratios of our debt stock is not as robust as people think. So what we're trying to do really is to streamline the debt value, the chain, so if we may call it as such. And we have counties that under the law are allowed to borrow as well. And we don't have a capacity to assess the amounts that they can borrow sustainably. The institution we create would also be able to advise analytically on to which county can manage what level of debt, because it's an area we're going into. We have learned from Nigeria before it got to where it is again, that the states, the subnational borrowing had destabilized, in a sense, the macro assessment, what debt they should get. The laws were somewhat liberal. And so I think that what we are doing is we are stepping to a little extent ahead of our time and to a large extent within where we are, so that we have a good grasp both of where we are and how we are going to move the trajectory of that debt and how the economy is performing. And with some we should have some respect to macroeconomic assessments and work within those. If we don't do that, we shall be able to. We shall find ourselves in the diabetic condition, and we shan't be able to get out of it easily. So I really think that all these ideas being thrown around could be okay if we had a framework that we can say it's under control. It's an outcome that we are largely managing, and that we are not simply playing catch up.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Bunyasi. Let me quickly begin, Dr. McPhee, to wrap up this first part of our webinar. Dr. McPhee, a lot to take in. Perhaps you could just summarize it for us.
Yeah. If I could also try to just make something very, very clear, because none of our previous speakers have really made clear a point which I think is absolutely fundamental, and it comes up year after year after year. And if we don't have clarity of thought and clarity of expression, we're going to have confusion. And confusion, as you know, you can discuss things for the rest of your life. I thought that Honorable Kimunya made a point which I thought he was going to elaborate on, but he touched part of the problem. I think also David Ndii has always got his finger on the pulse. But let me just mention a couple of things. I'd like to turn to Article 220 of our Constitution, because unless we have this clear in our minds, we are confused. And I think it's very, very important that we get out of our state of confusion. Budgets of the national and county government shall contain A, estimates of revenue and expenditure, differentiating between recurrent and development expenditure. Now, the reason why I say that is that the press, the media, just like in the United States, you have the media talking, rubbish. Here in Kenya, I think it's something similar. Now, Mr. Kimunya, Honorable Kimunya mentioned, look, I come out of university, I want to buy a house, I get a mortgage, I borrow, and that's perfectly valid. And the point is that Kenya, if you look at the budget each year, the revenue expenditure is less than government revenue. And I think that's a very important thing to begin with. Let's not confuse debt repayment, which is a capital expenditure. In government, they will call that development expenditure, and interest, as David and Dee was speaking about, interest on debt. Now, the interest on debt is recurrent expenditure. And each year, if you take the total expenditure, the total revenue expenditure of the government, it is less than the revenue of the government. And I think that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. No one has mentioned that, but that is a fact. Now, the next thing is, I'm a director of a company where we borrow in order to repay debt. We are not in a very strong financial position, but that is something which many companies do. And so I think it's important always to keep in mind that we may not, at a particular moment in time, be able to repay our debt in full, and we borrow in order to repay debt. But that is not borrowing to cover our revenue expenditure. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get this absolutely clear in our minds. And we've got to be clear about this, because if we're not clear about this particular fact, we are confused, and confusion leads to errors of all sorts. So the first thing to keep in mind is we cover our interest expenses. Now, interest is, it's rising by an enormous amount. That is a dangerous situation. It didn't used to be the biggest single line item in our revenue expenditure. Today it is. So if we continue to borrow more and more, there will come a time when the interest cost, which is now higher than the amount paid or payable to the county governments, which as a minimum under our constitution, as it is presently formulated, is 15%, but our interest is more than 15%. And that is revenue expenditure, and it's rising. As David and Dee mentioned, it is in fact rising at a rate which is higher than the rate of growth of GDP and many other things. Now, at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, we demand from the government that it build roads, bridges, et cetera, airports and so on. Now, we don't have the money to do those things. So what do we got to do? We've got to borrow to carry out that capital expenditure. Just as I come out of university, I don't have a salary big enough to buy a house, I borrow. The only thing that we've got to understand is that there needs to be a surplus. If I borrow money, let's say on a mortgage, I've got to have surplus income in order to repay that particular loan. And I think this is where we have some problems. But I think it's very important here. We must make the distinction. And please, ladies and gentlemen, demand this not only of yourself, but of other people. Because I get frustrated every year because people talk about, oh, this is the deficit. Well, the deficit is present. Why? Because we need new roads. If you go to Western Kenya today, over a weekend, you'll realize we need a dual carriageway from Nairobi right up to, certainly Eldoret and right up to the border with Uganda. So we don't have the tax income to actually do that. What do we got to do? We've got to borrow. So I think we have to have balance. There is another problem which Honorable Bunyasi mentioned, and that is our corruption. As you know, President Uhuru Kenyatta himself has said, look, we're losing 2 billion shillings a day, that is 800 billion shillings a year in corruption. We have to stop that, ladies and gentlemen. But that's you and me, because we're all corrupt in Kenya. We say, well, the other guys are corrupt, but You know, we have to be honest. Honesty must become part of our culture. And if we don't do this, we're going to go the way of Venezuela. And Venezuela, you'll see, was the second largest country at 214% of its GDP. It has oil reserves, the biggest in the world, of 300 billion barrels of oil. But because of mismanagement of their economy, they're the poorest country in South America. I hope and pray that the mismanagement that I see everywhere, not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector, I just hope and pray that that is not going to drive us into a Venezuela situation. But please, ladies and gentlemen, please have it absolutely clear. We do cover our revenue expenditure. And it's very important that we keep in mind Article 220 of our Constitution. Budgets there, and in this particular case, differentiating between recurrent and development expenditure. I thought you were going to do Mr. Kimunya, okay? But clearly you haven't been thinking like your teacher has been thinking. That's me. Thank you.
I will at some point.
Thank you, Dr. McPhee. I'll bring in Dr. David D right now. But before I do, just a question to Honorable Musalia, and I think I really need to ask you this, as well as your colleagues from the National Assembly and Honorable Kimunya. Is bad politics failing us in managing our economy? I think I'll start with you, Honorable Musalia. Honorable Musalia?
I think politics by its very nature is bad.
Okay. Honorable Kimunya, perhaps I'll throw it to you. Is bad politics failing us in the management of our economy? Or put differently, do we have the political will to manage the economy properly?
I believe the Jubilee government has the goodwill to manage the economy, but bad politics is bad. By its own nature, bad politics will mess up everything, will mess up development, will mess up the development. And Kenya is perhaps one of the unique countries in this world where you have an election today and tomorrow people on the campaign trail looking for seats for the next election. Now, at what point will the economy stabilize? Right? When will people get predictability in terms of what the government in office will do? Because it's like the concentration is more on futuristic. Yeah, I'm very concerned, for example, now to even know that we have people within government who should be implementing government policies, but are busy working on post-2022 policies and abandoning what is there and taking the people's attention from what we should be doing to what they will do if they get into office. That is the sad reality of irresponsibility in our politics, right? That people who are being given positions to lead, instead of leading, are busy looking for futuristic, competing against Musalia Mudavadi, who is not in government, right? He can give us his manifesto for the future. But for somebody in government to start giving us their manifesto for the future, instead of assisting in the government he's in to do it, that is the height of irresponsibility. And that's the bad politics that is messing up this country.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps a question for Honorable Opio Wandai. Honorable, I think Honorable Musalia touched on it. The composition of our institutions, and I think there was, he alluded to the fact that perhaps despite the Constitution, they are not using the power that they have, for lack of a better term. But from where you sit as chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, is Parliament able to adequately pay its oversight role, given the situation we're in, and check the executive at the same time?
Under the current constitution, it is the role of the Parliament and Fiscal National Assembly to play its oversight role over the executive and other arms of government, okay? And when I talk about Parliament here, I mean both sides of the House, that is the minority and the majority sides. And this it has done. How successfully is a question of interpretation. But then the most important thing to understand is that Parliament does not operate in isolation, in some kind of vacuum, in some island. Parliament is part and parcel of society, okay? And therefore, when we have got bad politics, like the one you alluded to, okay? Even the oversight work of Parliament is affected, And that's why when you want to look at governance and oversight in totality, we must look at it from a perspective of addressing all the issues that would affect our politics as it is here.
Okay, but Honorable Wandai, some might argue that just given the realities of our day, the current reality after the events of March 2018, that the executive, for all intents and purposes, is controlling Parliament. How then can that Parliament, adequately oversight the executive?
I don't know. I don't understand what you mean by controlling, because any executive anywhere in the world would want to, of course, to have influence over Parliament. Yes, for its policies to run smoothly, really, for its agenda to go through the House. Okay, and I don't think that the March 9, 2018 handshake, as it were, has in any way affected the capacity of Parliament, and in this case, the minority side to oversight the government. As I speak, I chair the Public Accounts Committee, and there's no single day I have been put under any form of pressure, okay, to conduct the affairs of my committee one way or the other. And therefore, I believe that the parliamentarians, both from the minority and the majority sides, have got the leeway to play their oversight role. Yeah. If they are failing, it is not because of the handshake. There could be other reasons. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Honorable Bunyasi, if you're still there, given that you have unique insight into how the World Bank, IMF, IFC work, there's a question for you. Are these terrible institutions, are they the face of all that is wrong with the international lending system? And are they fair to developing countries such as ours? Hello, Honorable Bunyasi?
Come on.
Hello, we can't hear you, sir.
Trying to
Yes, go on.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, no, sorry. I was saying that these international institutions, public international institutions, do develop their own dynamism, that they have a certain acquired self-interest as prefects of the world, as it were, and they may not necessarily, remember, they are working with their main donors, as it were, their main controllers, as well as with developing countries. And sometimes there is, in my view, a sort of paternalistic approach to things. They must work their way out of that paternalistic attitude. The stronger ones like India, like Brazil at one time, perhaps India is the better one now, who have and China for a while, have developed a capacity to to challenge the thinking that originates from these Bretton Woods institutions, for example.
Okay, thank you, sir. Before I bring in Dr. Ndii. Oh. Okay, we can't hear you, sir. We'll come back to you. But before I bring in Dr. Ndii, Honorable Musalia, I just wanted to ask you, Honorable Bunyasi alluded to, gave a very nice analogy about the country slipping into the diabetic condition. So, given your unique viewpoint, having managed the economy during Mzee Moi's era, of course, seeing what unfolded during the Kibaki era and what is unfolding now, how soon before we slip into a diabetic coma, to borrow the analogy from Bunyasi?
I think it's dangerous. We're in a dangerous situation. As much as we may want to deny, the reality is that the legal framework that relates to our debt matters has not been effective enough. And I think even the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee has admitted that there are areas that need to be sorted out. For instance, we have not even touched on public debt as it relates to even parastatals. You'll be surprised that there are some parastatals or other government agencies that are steeply neck high, let me put it that way, neck high in debt. And some of this debt comes as an afterthought. The reporting comes as an afterthought to Parliament. So these are the kind of things that if we have to go into the future, we need to address. And when I speak to this issue of debt, I'm not speaking specifically to the government of the day. I want us to look at debt in the context of posterity. What does it mean to the Kenyans who will be sweating and doing a lot of work in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, if we are going to plunge them into debt? So I think my appeal to the colleagues here and to the Kenyan people is that let us take the Sakwa Bunyasi bill seriously. And I must admit that on this, I've also had some time to consult with Kimunya on it, though briefly, but I hope the conversation we had then was that we will look at it and see how it can be improved, will be carried through, because we need not just to talk about it, we now need to start offering solutions. Not too long ago, for instance, when we changed the Central Bank Act, you will recall that a governor would make the central bank his home. People would work endlessly and serve endlessly, basically at the pleasure of the president of the day. Now, this has changed. The governor has security of tenure. But you will recall that even within the context of the overdrafts that the central bank would be able to get from the public, as it was capped, a ceiling was put there, because all this was feeding into the hard times that Kenyans were facing. If you look at taxation, for instance, KRA is projecting that they will reach out to about 4.4 million Kenyans to submit their returns. And maybe you're looking at a population, a working population that could be close to 20 million. All right, so there's room for growth, but it must be room that is also reasonable, also comfortable for Kenyans, so that we are allowing businesses to grow. We are allowing people to do what is necessary so that they can have the capacity to pay the tax without too much pressure. In South Africa, for instance, when it comes to revenue collection, the South African country has achieved about 25% of their GDP when it comes to revenue collection. In Kenya, we are at 14%. So clearly there's a gap. We can do much more to achieve this. But for heaven's sake, I want to plead to the Kenyan people let us not in any way underestimate the debt issue that we are in. I spoke about this as far back as 2015, emphasizing that there is need for us to rationalize our borrowing. I still maintain we must do so. It's for posterity. It's not about criticizing the government of the day. This is for posterity. If you are in Parliament and you see how the debt issues come in, maybe they will come in papers or reports that are tabled in Parliament. And what I used to see happening was that you'd have sessional papers which involve the debt that you are supposed to incur, and you're supposed to debate it within 7 days. You have not had an opportunity to assess the risk and everything. Parliament is being told that if you do not approve this sessional paper within the context of 7 days, then it is assumed that the debt has been legally incurred. Now, these are things that we need to address as a nation, and we need to improve through better legislation. And if indeed somebody has got a better idea than what Sakwa Bunyasi will be offering, please bring it on the table. Because this debt is ours. And honor for Kenyan people will remain in their ability to be able to pay back their debts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Davedi. So let's quickly move to the second part of our discussion this afternoon. And I will now bring in Dr. David D., renowned economist, columnist, author, excuse me, a Rhodes Scholar. Dr. D., is the economy truly worse than it's ever been? And if it is, how can we fix it? And how can we fix it in the context of our public debt management? Welcome, Dr. D.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I would like to sort of talk about debt first, not the economy, because I think there are quite a few things I would like to clarify in terms of just understanding what debt is from the previous sessions, as well as the presentation that Angela made. One is the nomenclature when we talk about foreign and domestic debt and the structure of that debt. There's a lot of emphasis on foreign debt. But in fact, half of our debt is domestic, half is foreign. It was mentioned before. But the domestic debt is much more expensive than the foreign debt. While the domestic debt is 50% of the debt, is half, it accounts for 3/4 of the interest that we pay. Because domestic interest rates are about 10%, even for government, sort of going up to 14%, depending on some longer term bonds, while the global interest rates, I think our borrowing rates, if you combine concessional and commercial, are about 4%, 5%, half of that. So domestic debt is much more expensive. But even that nomenclature is not very good, because there is quite a lot of foreign participation in the domestic debt market. Yeah. So a much better nomenclature is to talk about domestic currency debt and foreign currency debt, because also Kenyans participate in foreign currency debt in the sovereign bonds. Then beyond that, I think an even better nomenclature between that is to talk about market debt and bank debt. Because as Jim McAfee said, governments never really repay market debt. What you do is you keep rolling over and you pay interest. There's actually never intention to repay, to sort of repay market debt. Why not? Because if you're borrowing to invest and your economy is expanding, the sort of the market debt, the instruments, what you borrowed before, actually, you're better off using that money for investment than paying off the debt if you're investing in productive assets. But you have to pay interest fairly regularly from that's what the income. The income is what the people who have lent you are looking to. bank debt, which is predominantly foreign, mostly historically our bank debt has been from DFIs like the World Bank and the FDB, but increasingly we have Chinese DFI debt, has, although you want to roll it over, the problem is that it has principal repayments, which has cash flow implications for the government. Because when the principal repayments are coming through, you actually have to cough cash. You cannot recycle that debt as you would do a bond. If you are talking about Eurobond, to repay new old bank, just issue new ones. And in fact, many of the investors actually just roll over. But right now, I think the biggest cash flow squeeze is coming from Chinese Exim Bank debt. I read the other day that the repayments of both principal interest this year or next year are going to hit about 100 billion. Because it's medium-term debt. I think there's some 15 years with 4 or 5 year grace. So you're repaying the entire of this railway debt, the principal in about 10 years. So our structure of debt, part of what has happened to cause our debt distress is the structure of our debt has changed very fundamentally under Jubilee. So there's both volume and structure and cost. The second point I want to make is that the debt burden is growing exponentially. So it's getting worse, what we call in economics an explosive path. Yeah, you know, those who know math know when your second derivative, the sign is positive, so that your curve is convex, you've got a concave, you've got a problem. What does that mean? To illustrate, this year alone, I mean the year that's just ending, the debt has increased by 1 trillion shillings. Right, that's COVID, yeah. That's about 10% of GDP. But even the previous year, it increased by 5 trillion. So while GDP found debt at 40% of GDP, it is now 70% of GDP. But that 10 percentage points has only been incurred in 1 year and another 5% the previous year. So that curve is headed straight up. And the implications for that for interest payments is atrocious. So I think when this government came into office, the interest as a percentage of revenue, interest was only consuming about 12% of revenue, which is quite acceptable. It is now 25% and rising. So that's what's really crowding out a lot of your expenditures. So I just wanted to give a sort of overview of why do we say that is a problem. If you're talking about this year, if the interest is going to grow by about 100 billion, which is, I think that if you borrowed 1 trillion, your interest is probably going to go by 100 billion. That means that your interest cost is going to rise now from about 450 to about almost 600, 550 plus. It's now bigger than the wage bill. I don't think that's a healthy situation. Now, I started warning about this in 2014. I remember the first column I wrote talking about the debt crisis, that the danger of what we do was in August 2014. Now, the Jubilee government had not been in office very long. And I actually just pulled up what I wrote, and I think it's important because explain how did I get to this conclusion. I wrote that whatever the case, we cannot afford to continue on the fiscal path that we are on. It is reckless. If we don't do it ourselves, the iron laws of economics will do it for us, and that, take it from me, does not come cheap. And that's where we are. Because we've now signed onto an IMF program, which tries to fix the problem with a conundrum of austerity, while at the same time you're relying on growth to reduce the debt burden, to grow out of it. But you're trying to grow out of it by also implementing austerity, which is expanding tax collection and reducing expenditure. So you're saying that your policies are contractionary. Your fiscal policy regime is contractionary, but you are expecting to grow out of the problem. That is Greece. So we've got ourselves into the Greece sort of situation with the IMF. Now, how did I then sort of start warning about this before it happened? The answer is very simple, because I was tracking the deficit. And within a very short time, when the Jubilee came to office, the deficit on a running basis, month on month, every last 12 months, increased from 200 billion to 600 billion, threefold. And that's what I was reacting to, saying, if you keep increasing the deficit at this rate, you're going to be in trouble very, very soon. Now, why is that important? Because debt comes from deficit financing. We talk a lot about debt, but we don't talk about the deficit. The debt is the stock. Those of you accountants, the deficit is the flow. Now, if you're to manage an economy, and Kimunya and Musalia have both managed economy, but they've said remarkably little about what sort of magnitudes you should have, which are prudent to have. You want, in a developing country like this, where you want to grow rapidly, you've got investment, public investment demands to make steel. You want to run a deficit of no more than 3% of GDP. So that you have headroom if you have economic shocks, because we are very susceptible to shocks. You want to be able to ramp that up to 4 to 5%. And then a year or two down the road, you go back to about 3 to 3.5%. That is sustainable. Now, how do you finance development if you're only borrowing 3% of GDP? By something we call public saving, which is you want to be collecting about 18 to 20% of GDP in revenue and spending 15% on recurrent. So you are able to transfer that 5%, add 3% borrowed, so that the public sector then contributes about 7% of GDP in investment. Hopefully your private sector does 15%, and you have a 22% of GDP investment. That's what a finance minister who knows his or her macro programming would do. Now, Jubilee started running a budget deficit of 8% from year one without an economic shock that you are responding to. If you look at the Kibaki era, when we were caught by the global financial crisis, we were almost running a balanced budget. Something like whatever. You just come out of a balanced budget, you are running like 2%. You had both the PEV and the global financial crisis. So you could run a stimulus package, getting yourself up to 4%. And then after the crisis, you go back down to a rational level. Now, you do not stimulate an economy up to 8% of GDP when you don't have a problem. Now, when you do that, you're doing two things. Because half of that money is borrowed from the domestic market, you have completely crowded out your private sector. Okay. Secondly, it is not possible to be able to have enough viable projects to put in that kind of money, to ramp up your public investment that quickly. So that money will be put into wasteful projects. So first of all, you've crowded out the private sector and you've put money into wasteful investments, because even as a business, if you see a business ramping up capex 3-4 times, you're probably putting it into bad projects. Kenya Airways, Mumias, Uchumi, Nakumat. Okay, government is not different. So there are only so many good projects at a point in time. So if you sort of throwing money at things, you're probably throwing money at the wrong things. So we threw money at things, took money from the private sector, threw it at things, and the consequence was your revenue to GDP ratio falls from 18% to 13%, because you've crowded out the productive economy, which pays tax. And what you are now calling growth is deficit spending. So your growth rate, your headline growth rate looks the same because government is pouring concrete all over the place, but it is not productive growth. It is wasteful spending, which has crowded out the revenue generating private sector economy. So then your repayments come due, your revenue yield has fallen, and your repayments are coming due. So you have a situation where our revenue yield is 13% of GDP. Interest used to be 2% of GDP out of 18% revenue. So you paid interest and you are left with 18% of GDP, of 60% of GDP to spend on other things. Now your revenue is 13% of GDP and your interest is 4% of GDP. So you have only 9% of GDP to spend on other things. So the amount of money you have to spend on other things has come down from 16% of GDP to 9% of GDP. That's why you have pending bills. That's why you are unable to meet your sort of social spending obligations. That's why your projects are going to stall. So the point I want to conclude by saying, this number of what percentage of GDP is not the relevant number. It is rates of change that matter, not the point, not the stock at a point in time. You can accumulate debt from 50 to 150% of GDP over 2 to 3 decades. Okay, as your economy is expanding, that's how people like Japan get there. But you cannot accumulate debt from 40% to 70% of GDP over less than 10 years without consequence. So the key thing here is rate of change. So this debate about what percentage of GDP matter is not the question. Even from 10% of GDP to only 30% of GDP within 5 years will bankrupt you. But the key number which has gotten us here is a very irresponsible fiscal regime running 8% deficit over a decade with a parliament, with people like Kimunya who understand fiscal programming, but nobody's talking about it. I have been the lone voice in the wilderness talking about this deficit spending and this money going into irresponsible projects. I mean, you couldn't have enough projects to put that kind of money at any point. And of course, if you throw money at things, a lot of it will also fuel corruption, as well as the crowding out effect. So that's my take on that particular situation that we're in. And that's then the connection with the economy. I need to do that so that you can see the connection with the economy. How does it then, the debt interact with the economy? The crowding out effect is a big problem. So until you unwind that crowding out effect, you can't sort of fix the economy.
Dr. Nde Atusha asks a very pointed question. How then do we stop wasteful projects? Seems to me that is where the problem lies. With long-term project planning, does it seem to suggest that GOK does not properly plan projects?
Sakwa Bunyasi mentioned something about project appraisal and proper public investment programming. When I used to do this sort of policy work 25 years ago, we used to have something called a public investment program. A public investment program was a document which ranked all of government projects by rate of return in a schedule. And so you would then do your macro programming and say, if we are going to invest 5% of GDP, that takes us to project 18. Project 19 downwards, we'll have to wait. And if you get more money, you pull one more project up. I think the first project I remember causing a lot of controversy, trying to jump the queue, was the Takwel Power Project. And there was a lot of fighting. I remember, in fact, my friend, former PS, Aremule, left government as a result because he refused to approve it. And Moi actually forced him out. Okay? Somewhere along the line, that sort of public investment programming discipline went out the window. Vision 2030 changed the paradigm fundamentally, and I complained a lot about that over the years. It went into this thing called the flagship project, totally different paradigm, so that if a project is declared a flagship program and there's a chorus around it, like the SGR railway, you can't get in a rational word edgeways about the viability of the project. The public joins in the chorus, and it goes. So as long as the president is running around, launching Vision 2030 flagship projects, you couldn't get rational conversation around investment programming going.
Okay, thank you, sir. Honorable Kimunya, I see your hand up. Is it a comment or rebuttal?
It's just a quick thing that was triggered by both my teacher in accounting, Jim McPhee, and David. And because even as David was concluding, he seemed to underscore this whole issue of we are spending more on the recurrent expenditure than even the revenue we are getting. And there's one statistics we all seem to forget, and I'm not here to defend the government, but and I'm just comparing. I know even my time in the treasury, we had a balanced budget, but in comes 2010 Constitution with lots of activism and activism-related commitments. You know, we must provide water in sufficient quantities, or basic education must be free and compulsory. You know, there's a whole lot of things that were brought in. Now, if you just look at typically annual budget, education takes 27% of the budget, but that's recurrent. Yet, if you look at it from a different perspective, it should actually be classified as development expenditure, because you're developing the human resource. But when you now take 27% into that, and then you add whatever you have to spend on water, whatever you have to spend on social spending, all the things you have to, the money you have to give for devolution and agriculture and the roads you need to do to interconnect all these people, your regional obligations in terms of, for example, the rail and the power connectivity that you need, otherwise people remain in darkness, yet you have to liberate them. Then you sympathize with the government of the day. And it's not just the Jubilee government. Even the governments that will come in the future will be faced with exactly the same problem. In fact, it will be even far more compounded because the populations are growing and the revenues are going down. But so that's one of the things that we perhaps forget, that yes, 2013, the Jubilee government inherited a new constitution with certain obligations, the same tax base, yeah, and a higher population with more demands, which have to be met. And perhaps that had not been factored even in the manifestos and all that. So as a result, we end up at one point, even before you factored in development, we've already blown up the entire revenue on recurrent, and actually had to borrow some to even finance some of the recurrent expenditure, which you cannot postpone. Because you're not going to say, let kids not go to school, let women not go to the maternities, let's not spend on COVID. I agree, there is lots of waste, and I think no less than the president himself has, alluded to that fact with the 2 billion per day, which, if you work out backwards, you'll find comes to about 700. And when Philip Kinisu was the chair of EACC, the anti-corruption, he actually gave us a statistic that 30% from their own workings was being wasted. So 30% or 2.1 trillion works out the 700, the 200, the 2 billion per day. So that's the basis of that figure. And because it was alluded by the people who are supposed to be chasing graft. But I think the question I would like us to think of is, I think we all agree, debt is not a problem. The problem is, what do you do with the debt? The utilization of the debts, okay? And I'm glad, I think one of the issues that we are blaming the international organizations is they are lenders and they are responsible lenders. So IMF gives us 255 billion over the next 38 months, to repayable in 10 years with a 3-year moratorium at 0%. They obviously want to make sure that that money goes towards, the 4 core items they have identified. And if every lender was to help us with that, perhaps it can help. So it's not, I actually welcome those kind of conditionalities because they help us to be a bit more responsible and not to respond to every wish that people, who visit the leadership say, we want our road, you can have it. We want electricity, you can have it. Yeah, because that perhaps is part of the problems we've had. And luckily, we've learned, and I hope, those wanting to form government in future have also learned that that's a bad way of doing it, because we are where we are because we put ourselves. But unfortunately, I also don't want us to give the impression, even to our youngsters, because when I go to the constituency and I'm telling young guys, we have money for Uwezo funds, we have money for the youth fund, can you form groups and borrow this money and better your life through projects? They look at it and say, we are scared of borrowing because everyone is telling us borrowing is bad. Let us not overplay this thing about borrowing to the extent that we even kill our entrepreneurs who need to go to the bank, borrow some money, and convert a good idea into profitability. Let us concentrate on utilization of the money so that if a farmer goes to, like the cherry fund, the coffee cherry fund, we loan 3 billion. Less than 10% of that has been taken because families are telling the farmers, don't go and get that fund. Yeah, don't get that advance because they believe those who've taken it in the past have blown it in the past and the families have not benefited. And I think those are some of the things that we need to take this conversation to a different scale where we emphasize the misuse of funds as opposed to the financing of projects, whether it's through debt, whether it's through taxes. Misuse of funds is bad. And I believe that's where we need to think of. Lastly, I just want to mention, so I don't have to come back on it. I know there's issues about, am I basically saying perhaps a debt management authority is not good? We have the privatization authority in place. Has it helped privatization in this country? The last privatization that took place in this country was 2008 when I privatized Safaricom. Yet we have a privatization authority that we pay every month because it was put there because people thought that's the better way of doing it. We have the Public Procurement and Oversight Authority. Why are we still having issues with procurement corruption? Yeah, yet we have a PPOA, right? So it's creating these bodies does not necessarily improve things. What we need to think of is, can we make the current structures work better rather than bringing others, that just duplicate? And you can see the problem we're having even between the Police Commission and Inspector General. Yeah, I think those are some of the issues, but we will discuss some of these things later in public and in Parliament, so that we see how to tinker things to make it better to manage public debt, but not necessarily by creating more authorities or more bodies. I think that's perhaps the only thing I wanted to say. But let's not make borrowing or debts, look so bad. But the use of the money is what we need to concentrate on. And on that one, I'm in total agreement with everyone that we need more prudent management of our public finances.
Okay, thank you, Honorable. I think that's a nice segue, into our next presentation by Wanjiru Kikonyo. Wanjiru Kikonyo is a champion for participatory decentralized governance and is committed to the promotion of citizen-led accountability. She's committed to the promotion of constitutionalism as the basis for inclusive and sustainable development. She serves as a founding member of TISA, that is the Institute for Social Accountability, which has been instrumental in advocating for effective devolution and meaningful public participation in Kenya. It is worth noting that TISA also convenes the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, a civil society platform that is pushing for political accountability as a solution to the Kenya debt crisis. And Wanjiru, as you start, I noticed the use of the word activism by the majority leader. Perhaps we'll touch on that briefly, but just tell us, what has been the role of civil society in oversight in public spending, and what milestones have we achieved since 2013?
Okay, Walter, thanks so much. You're throwing me right into it. It's unfortunate. First of all, thanks. It's great to be on this panel and very robust conversations. I strongly associate with what David D had to say. In fact, a lot of my I had to cancel a lot of things that I had wanted to say. Honorable Sakwa as well, Honorable Wangai as well, talking about the loopholes, talking about the violations. So we know we're in a crisis, we know why. It's important to focus on how we're going to get out of this. The idea that there's a lot of activism in the Constitution really is quite contemptuous of Kenyans and the process of our constitution making, which was to reverse decades of a stranglehold on the economy and political processes by a small elite. And yes, it is an activist constitution, it's a revolution, and it's a revolution for democratization, for accountability. And the idea that the Constitution has driven us into this debt crisis is fallacious. There was a report by the Auditor General commissioned, I believe in 2014, 2015, the report may have been tabled in Parliament around 2016, that found this is not the case. That actually what was driving the rising wage bill, the runaway expenditure of government was the large-scale infrastructure projects informed by the Vision 2030, was the failure of the national government to downsize its operations to allow devolution and county governments to grow, because the recommendations of the task force on devolved government was, as counties take over major services, the national government has its assigned roles that do not need this huge human resources, and there needs to be a process of transfer. Now, unfortunately, that was completely botched. And if you look at the wage bill of the national government, it's continued to grow in terms of the size of the wage bill, also in terms of the numbers that the government employs. And this is because we have a government that treats devolution as a side issue. And therefore, we are running 48 full governments instead of running 2 levels of devolved government. So the national government retained its expenses, and we have also got devolved government that's not adequately funded. And the inadequacies in funding devolved government include inadequate investment in agriculture, in healthcare. And that is why when the COVID pandemic hit, the ability of government to respond was extremely muted, and we needed to go for debt, not just because of the scale of the crisis, but also because we had not been adequately investing, despite the fact that over the years, we've seen that agriculture has been contributing significantly to the GDP. So it's back to the point that David said, misplaced priorities. Misplaced ideology. We have a centrist government that didn't embrace devolution or decentralization. And even in the resolution of debt, we are seeing the same problem. And why would I say that? I'd say that because if you look at the fiscal consolidation program that the Treasury has signed with the IMF, the first question you ask is, how does the Treasury get to sign up such significant reforms with the IMF without public participation, without tabling this agreement before Parliament? And this is where I fully agree that there's a major loophole, but also a lack of political leadership, where you need the government really to acknowledge we're in a major crisis. And I think David laid it out very well. And all hands need to come on deck to save this problem. Not only Parliament, not only the public, but also the political actors. Why? Because we are heading towards an election. Even if a fiscal consolidation program is signed today, and it only has one side of the political divide, one part of political actors who have signed on, and then we have a new political regime coming in 2022, and all these suggestions that we postpone elections should not be sanctioned by a government that has really violated the law to bring us here and continues to imagine they can violate the law more willy-nilly. So we need to get cross-party support. And it's possible that this crisis might play a role in diffusing this toxic political climate we are in. because all political actors need to come on board and look at what is the IMF proposing. The IMF is not proposing anything new. Unfortunately, the IMF also comes in with some remedies that don't work, and one of them was touched upon, which is their treatment of tax and the inability, or rather their inability to deal with tax and consider the realities in which we are working in, to look at the issue of equity in taxation, to focus really on the exemptions. They have prioritized that, but is the political will there for those exemptions to be removed, for those who earn more to pay more, for companies that have benefited from irregular, illegal, or wasteful exemptions to pay that money back? So the IMF ignores the political context and comes with remedies that they put on the books, sign with the Treasury, and then are not accountable. So we need, in terms of moving forward, we need to open up this fiscal consolidation program. We cannot afford to go back to what happened in the 90s, where governments again signed up to a structural adjustment program without public participation, without the approval of their parliaments, only for then, the cry later to be, oh, we need to move. The African Charter was signed up at the height of the ravage of the structural adjustment programs of the 80s. So in the 90s, African governments said, never again will we move without the people. We must focus on people-centered development and put people at the center of development, especially with regard to these big kind of discussions. So if you look at best case examples of other countries that have gone through fiscal consolidation programs, you need robust discussion. We need to challenge the revenue targets that are being put in there, which are unrealistic. We need to ask the question of sovereignty. How come Parliament has put in their the back report, looking at the budget policy statement, they have recommended a deficit of 7.5% of GDP. And then we have the fiscal consolidation program working with a deficit of 8.7%. Are we saying that Kenya is a banana republic? Is the IMF stronger than our parliament? Where does our sovereignty lie? And you heard Parliament pushing back and saying they will not allow that deficit. Why? As David told us, there are projects in the budget, and the former AG told us it's budgeted corruption. We closed and made the PFM system very tight in law. So the only way to get through mega corruption projects is to write them into the budget, budgeted corruption. And some of those are overinflated. Many of those projects failed. Their initial assessment reports should never have been initiated. And a proper audit of these projects, because this has been recommended in the fiscal consolidation program. And the date for this actually is, I think, by the end of the month of June. This audit needs to have been done. It needs to look at return on investment. It needs to look at value for money. It needs to look at whether those particular projects were procured or initiated in line with the legal requirements. And if not, they should be culled. And you will find a lot of the, so many projects will fall off the wayside. We then don't pay them. We deal with the legal contractual issues around that, but then we can begin to push down the deficit. The last point last 2 points very quickly is devolution. We need to focus on fiscal decentralization. There was a recommendation to have an intergovernmental loans council that manages and oversights debt. It's time we get back to that, because the borrowing of the national government is undermining devolution. Last thing, those public and state officers who have put us in this crisis, we as civil society, we need to push, and we will push for them to pay. So we need officers who have violated the law need to be brought to account, because that's the only way we can tell our public officers, our politicians, we will not tolerate you taking Kenyans for granted by violating the law, putting us in a financial mess, which translates into higher taxation for Kenyans. Very, very last thing, We need to change our mindset to one of sustainable development. Vision 2030 infrastructure-led development paradigm is not working. We need to go back and look at more modular type of development, more bottom-up. We are seeing fantastic examples at the counties of bottom-up. So we need to balance the large infrastructure with community level development investments so that we can have a sustainable development model. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Wanjiru. I'll quickly bring in Phyllis Wakiaga, the current Chief Executive of the Kenya Association of Manufacturers and an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. She holds a master's in international trade and investment law and a master's in business management. Phyllis, the business environment has become, quite difficult for many people, particularly SMEs, especially, in the context of just the things we're discussing, but also the COVID-19 pandemic. But from where you sit, what has been the effect of Kenya's public debt management on the business environment?
Thanks, Walter, for the question and all the previous speakers. I think it's been a very engaging evening listening to all of you. I had summarized my thoughts in a presentation, and for the efficiency of time, I think I'll stick to it because it's a very interesting subject. I could speak for a while on it. So I'll start with a quote. A renowned American economist, Martin Fieldstein, who said that increased government spending can provide a temporary stimulus to demand and output, but in the longer run, higher levels of government spending and borrowing simply crowd out the private investment or require taxes that weaken growth by reducing incentives to save, invest, innovate, and work. Okay. Yeah, so we can move to the next slide on public debt. I think this the slide has been discussed by everyone from the beginning. It's evident that the public debt has been increasing as a result of the persistent fiscal deficits, and the rise in debt stock and the subsequent debt service requirements are pushing up the interest payments and constraining funds available for development expenditure. And we've talked about the issues of the social sectors, also agriculture, health, and many other things that we're not able to spend money on. So the risk of Kenya's debt distress remains high in the context of the ongoing COVID-19. And I think the COVID pandemic has actually led to a sharp temporary decline in export and GDP growth and triggered a strong fiscal response, which has interrupted the planned fiscal consolidation. We spoke about already the domestic debt and external debt, which stand at almost 50-50. And for domestic debt, it does crowd out the private sector and reduces the availability of capital for private sector development. Then the servicing of the debt stock from 2014 to 2018, it's increased from 392 billion to 850 billion. And those are some of the concerns or the conversation that we are having about what impact this has had on the economy. So we can move to the next slide. The macroeconomic stability for any country is really fundamental if we are going to ignite the growth of the private sector and its contribution towards growth and development of the nation. And when we have these high levels of fiscal and current account deficits, it becomes a threat to the stable macroeconomic environment, which is really dependent on a stable exchange rate. And the high fiscal deficits have an impact also on the business environment, because what eventually happens is that we see higher taxation, higher borrowing costs, and greater exchange rate risk. And furthermore, high debt to GDP levels risk crowding out the private sector in the domestic markets, as I mentioned. Also for the debt to GDP ratio, this has been increasing. And a lot of this debt, as we've said, we borrow for obvious reasons, because we need to finance development infrastructural projects, our budget expenditures, and also refinance outstanding debt. But Dr. Bunyasi spoke about the high quality stock of debt. And from where we sit, the challenge is a lot of this debt and investment has not really been value for money in some cases, and the return on investment, especially on some of the projects, has not really grown fast enough. I mean, the economy has not grown fast enough to be able to absorb the cost of some of this. And that's why we really must come to how do we prioritize what projects. And I know Dr. Ndi did speak about the public investment program and how we used to rank projects and only spend on projects that have been prioritized and that have a high return on investment. The other big concern, of course, is the issue of misuse of funds, corruption, pilferage, and wastage, which eventually dilutes the ability of the money we've borrowed to have the impact that it intends to have in the economy. So the next slide will cover the issue of COVID-19. And we know that the pandemic has caused uncertainties in the global financial market, and we are seeing lenders seeking higher interest rates on loans advanced and sourcing for syndicated or commercial loans to retire maturing loans and other debt obligations will continue to expose the economy to a refinancing risk. So as a country, despite being classified as middle economy, the government should continue to negotiate for concessional and semi-concessional loans. So the impact on the business environment, I've already mentioned that, but we have seen a sharp downturn in the revenue and the new expenditure requirements, leading to a deficit of about 7.8% in 2019-2020. We also saw a drop in revenue from April to December 2020, where revenue dropped by about 15.8%. And this was mainly attributed to the measures that had been put in place to cushion the economy from the impact of COVID-19, like the income tax reductions, VAT, and also the reduction of the turnover tax. And all this provided the relief to taxpayers and reduced the shocks arising from the pandemic, but it also did have an impact on government revenue. And when government falls short of revenue, it turns to either reducing expenditure or increasing taxes. However, we have seen that we have moved more to increasing taxes as opposed to reducing the expenditures, the duplications that Wanjiro spoke about. We have quite a number of duplications, whether it's national and county government, and wastage that has not been addressed. Instead, we have seen increase in tax collection, targeting especially businesses in order to deal with this. We've seen this year, for example, the rolling back of the measures to cushion the economy and additional tax measures like the minimum tax, which is levied as 1% of turnover. The finance bill is also out and we are reviewing it to also see the impact. But what that does is that it makes the business environment hostile, and it's very unfriendly because of that lack of predictability, both for small and large businesses, and more so for small businesses. And it also affects the cost of products and drives up the cost of living for citizens, and eventually affects the government's ability to collect these same taxes. So our recommendation, as I come to the end, is first of all to undertake fiscal consolidation, because the public debt, as we've said, has been increasing as a result of the persistent fiscal deficit. And there's need then to consolidate, to look at this expenditure seriously and review the same. The other issue is really to look at how we undertake prudent financial management by ensuring that we manage our budgets effectively. We also need to look at the government ministries, departments, and agencies adhering to the public investment management guidelines to ensure that only critically reviewed and appraised projects that have a quick return and high social impact are budgeted for. So that is going to be very, very critical. We need to also ensure that we have a conducive business environment that allows business to thrive, and we look at our taxation regime or policy, or put in place, first of all, a taxation policy that doesn't get us to the laugher curve, because today we have a situation where additional tax is leading to less collection in a number of sectors. And we're also seeing duplication at national and county governments, with county governments also levying a number of fees and charges. We must tighten our belt and really reconsider priority expenditure. There is need to address the challenges we've kept mentioning on wastage, pilferage, and corruption, because that is critical if we're going to be able to address these issues. So that's the end of my presentation, and we look forward to any questions and engagements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll quickly bring in Mr. Jaindi Kisero, former Nation Media Group Managing Editor for Business and Economic Affairs, just to give us his sense of what we've discussed this session. Bwana Kisero, karibu. You're muted, sir.
Me. Hello?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Let me start by addressing the question of credentials. I have university training in economics, but I'm a journalist, first and foremost. A journalist, old-fashioned journalist, in the tradition of the most important role of a journalist is to make people uncomfortable. Now, one of my concerns as a journalist has been reporting of public debt. And I'm glad Mr. McPhee and Mr. Kimunya, who are accountants, are here. If I became the president of this country in a military coup, God forbid, I'd use the time I'm in that office before I'm kicked out and banished, first to go and approach ISPAC, the accountants body, to give me consultants to get the government move from a cash-based old-fashioned system to accrual accounting. I know Dr. McPhee and Mr. Kimunya know very well about our friend Luca Pacioli, who lived many years ago, who introduced something called double entry bookkeeping. Today, if you go to the government office, in the door there, there'll be some piece of paper where they'll have written something, a computer, what, and that's the asset register. That's how they record their asset register. If you want to measure debt, if you want to fix it, you have to measure it. So if you want to deal with debt and manage it, please, let's at least have a ledger. Today, what they give you as a debt register is an Excel sheet that can be changed. You don't even know where it came from. So the first, in my opinion, the first thing we must do is to sort out accounting, Mr. McPhee and Mr. Kimunya. In fact, Mr. Kimunya is only one of the few people who have been finance ministers who are accountants. The other class was, of course, the other guy who was top there was Udoro Tieno, who was the permanent secretary. But Kimunya was really the first top accountant to be minister. But we still have an antiquated old system that, where you don't know. I don't know whether you have looked at the debt register, external one lately. There are all manner of dodgy sounding creditors on that list. You don't even know where they came from. I was surprised to find out that the most expensive debt in the register today, the external debt, is the one from PTA Bank, 10%. I don't even know when PTA Bank started lending to sovereigns, to its shareholders. And I was surprised that once they arranged for us some loan, the top person on debt at the Treasury, Violet Kavisi, went there and became a director. Those are the things that concern us as a journalist, that we really need to get transparency. I agree with the Bunyasi's idea of a new authority, but not bodies. What we need there is a national treasury management agency with powers to issue debt, to deal with redemptions. We must remove this fiscal agent role from central bank to this office, and it must operate with a modern accounting system on an accrual basis. We don't just need, what we need is better management, better accounting of public debt. The other thing I want to talk about is, where did we go from? Where did we come from? Where did we end up where we are now? It starts with unrealistic GDP projections. Our GDP numbers don't make sense. Then you make unrealistic revenue projections. Then you make unrealistic budget deficit projections. You make unrealistic domestic borrowing requirements projections. Then you cut and paste, you cut and paste. And when they tell me about GDP to debt, that number doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me. What makes sense to me is GDP to revenues, because you're talking about cash. Cash is king. The other day they were trying to even raid unclaimed financial assets authority because they don't have money, they don't have cash, and they keep telling you about this aggressive and celebratory GDP numbers in the context of a stock exchange where all companies are issuing profit warnings every day, where if you look at a pickup of domestic credit, it's going south. So when they give you these celebratory numbers, you don't even know, I don't even know what they're talking about. May I rest my case there because I want to debate? Thank you. Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, sir. Yes, sir. We hear you. We hear you loud and clear. Thank you. Now, just some housekeeping. We were meant to have a Q&A session at the end of this, but I see we have run out of time. So, in the interest of time, and to be fair to my panelists and of course the audience, I will just allow everybody to make quick remarks, less than 1 minute. Then we can have Angela make the closing remarks and give a vote of thanks. So I'll start with you, Honorable Musalim Davadi. Please, your closing comments.
Thank you, Walter. Very quickly, let me just refer to Kimunye on one issue, the Privatization Commission. I think we should make institutions work. I don't know when Kimunye last saw anything about the Privatization Commission. It has one chairman called Tuoma, Honorable Tuoma. And for the last 3 years, Tuoma has been for the government to appoint the other 2 commissioners. So when you paralyze an institution by not making sure it's properly constituted, then you should not blame the institution for being in existence. But we have to look at the people who are supposed to have gazetted the others so that it's fully in place. So I hope Honorable Kimunye will take that up as majority leader and ensure that the commission is properly constituted. Now, I'll just go philosophical or spiritual on this one because we are coming to a conclusion. In the words of the Bible, and I'm quoting, as recorded by Prophet Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16, it says, our country is at crossroads with public debt management. And here's the verse itself. This is what the Lord says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths and ask where the good way is and walk in it. And if you will find rest for your souls, but you said, we will not walk in it. Now, let me conclude by just saying this. We have come to a time when, as a nation, we must stop pretending that all is well and heed those words in the Bible. We must stop at the junction, look around us, ask ourselves hard questions as a people, find the good old paths of progress, and walk in them that we may find rest. That is all I would like to say, especially when we are looking at the economy where we stand and where we want to go. Otherwise, once again, I thank InfoTrack for putting us together and having this conversation. It's a very healthy conversation, and I hope we shall all emerge the wiser. Thank you so much, and good evening to my brothers and sisters.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Honorable, less than 1 minute, your closing remark.
Yes, thank you, Walter, and thank you, InfoTrack, for this forum. And I want to thank at this other opportunity all the panelists and the participants who will be there for braving through this 2 hours plus. And I just want to say, I've seen many Kenyans who want to build a house, and every month they are there buying a lorry of sand, a lorry of stones, and accumulating that, hoping to eventually one day build their house. 10 years down the line, they are still renting accommodation. And by the time they build their house, they are too old to even enjoy it. That is what debt helps in terms of fast-tracking your future gains. And I still want to say, debt is not the problem. The problem is what we do with the money that we borrow. And if we can shift this conversation towards value for money, for the money we have received either through taxes or other revenues and debt, then perhaps we will stop, flogging the wrong horse, because we probably flog in debt. What we should be looking at, how can we stop the leakage, the 2 billion per day that's leaking out of our public expenditure systems. Once we sort out that, we will never have to worry about debt, because we'll be able to convert all that money into investment that should generate more money to repay our future past debts and including create more jobs for our growing population. That's where the conversation needs to be. But let's not flog on debt. I think we have the current legal structure, the institutional structures, and if you even look at World Bank, even from the indices in terms of our debt management, it's not that bad. At 3.1 or 2. So we probably, punishing ourselves too heavily for the wrong reason. And I agree with Honorable Musalia. It's time we look at it, but let's look at what the real problem is, the elephant in the room. It's not debt, it's the spending. It's value for money. It's the fight against corruption.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Honorable Wandai.
Thank you very much once again. I just wish to thank the InfoTrack team for enabling this conversation to take place. Indeed, very important conversation. As you know, public debt is a phenomenon that is here with us. Yeah, really. And how we manage it will determine whether it affects us positively or negatively. And therefore, I'm very happy to have been part and parcel of this process. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Honorable Bunyasi, if you're there, your closing remarks, please.
Hello?
Yes, sir. I can hear you. Go ahead.
I think that the discussion has been extremely illuminating, but I think what we must do is take care of the moment. We must deepen our grasp of the spending, the expenditure planning and spending, be very cognizant of our revenue shortfalls. But we should also remember that the bigger the budget does not necessarily mean the happier the country, the faster it will grow. There are many other underlying conditions that we have to pay attention to, that we are glossing over, sometimes for political reasons. I think that, for example, in the case of the Jubilee government, their biggest legacy would have been how stable an economy they would have left it, given how they took over from Kibaki. And Honorable Kimunya, I think, should tell us a bit more about the lack of virtues in excessive spending, that they were able to nearly balance the budget if it wasn't for the shocks of 2010. The shocks of 2010 should remind us that, yes, conditions are never standard, and you have to continuously change. To do that, We do need experts who are looking at this full time. And therefore, the creation of the Debt Management Authority is a means to that end. It's a means to that end in the sense that they will have the analytic capacity. They will be removed from the treasury and not be subject to daily controls. Therefore, I think it's maybe one of the ways to go. That has been done before. KRA was consolidated into a single agency, and that has worked very well. The Public Finance Management Act brought together a large number of acts that was needed. So sometimes when you set up a separate entity, we shouldn't look only at its fiscal implication, but we should look at its impact on the economy. I strongly believe that. I hope that we shall get around to debate these issues more broadly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Dr. D, your closing remarks?
Thank you. I'll be very honest. I find this conversation very exasperating because it is both wrong and dishonest. The problem is not of expenditure and value for money and all of that. It's a problem of running deliberate, irresponsible budget deficits. A country which runs a budget deficit of 8% per year, year in, year out, has a political loose nut somewhere. And then starts talking about debt as if it was not incurred deliberately. We need to find what that loose nut is. I think when we say 8% of GDP, maybe we don't get the point across. If your revenue is 18% of GDP, 8% of GDP deficit means you are spending 40% more than your income year in, year out. If you earn 100,000 shillings, you are running a credit card for 40,000 shillings every month and living large. If you do that for 10 years, the interest payment, if you are charged 10%, will be eating 40,000 of your salary, even without paying the principal, and you will be reduced to 60,000 shillings. That's why nobody would do that in their right mind. That's what we have been doing. I have been saying at every opportunity, and what I'm hearing here is we have to borrow. Let's not discourage borrowing. There's nothing wrong with borrowing, but we are not talking about the parameters of responsible borrowing. There is no responsible borrowing by a government which exceeds 4% of GDP on an ongoing basis. So either we face that we've been extremely irresponsible, and ask, why have we been so irresponsible and been cheering that irresponsible parliament, media, experts, all sorts of people who've been finance ministers and who wouldn't have done that themselves, our social agencies of restraint have collapsed. We are not going to get out of this problem in the next 5 years at best, because what we are doing now is, economists, there are two ways of going about a debt crisis at this point. One is called orthodox, which is what we're doing. It has never solved it, Greece and all those countries. Or heterodox, where you do very unorthodox things. Now, a government in the last year of its life will not do a radical heterodox program. So what we're doing is we're gonna kick this can down the road, and there are only two scenarios. Either we have a change of government and get a government which will actually try and run a heterodox agenda, and you have to be very creative to do that, or we stick with the IMF and all these programs until we have a political crisis or a financial meltdown. Otherwise, we are in a debt straitjacket unless something changes for at least a decade. That is the cost of what we have done over the last 10 years. So we either get a grip or we continue kicking the can down the road and still burying our head in the sand for political purposes. But I can tell you, this is not going to go away by us saying, oh, you know, let's not do this, let's not do that. It's extremely irresponsible.
Oh, okay, thank you, sir. Anjiro, closing remarks?
Yes, Walter, it's very difficult to speak after that because yes, there's a sense where, you know, it looks very hopeless. At the end of the day, we have to remember that the problem we're in is on account of political impunity, leadership impunity, violations of the Constitution, violations of the Public Finance Management Act by the political leadership consistently since 2014. We've now entered into a fiscal consolidation program that promises all kinds of remedies, which the government has been promising all along. The remedies in the report of the IMF have been in the BPS and the debt strategy paper as part of the remedies government is going to implement, privatization, you know, all of those. So the question is really, what is going to change? And at the end of the day, it's about political leadership. And we need to see political leadership if we are not going to, if the IMF program won't fail, because there are some milestones that have been set. And the government cannot meet those milestones without adhering, without actually implementing. So the real question is, will government rise to it? I hope so. We will push for them to. Recent history shows us it's not going to change anything. But we must change. And I agree with David with that. I think my positive thing is that there are people in parliament, there are people in government who want to do the right thing, religious leaders, business leaders. We need to come together and stop treating it like status quo. We are in a crisis. We need all hands on deck. And we need to call out and ensure the right things happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Manjiro. Phyllis, closing remarks?
Thank you very much. I just want to echo what the previous speakers have said. As business, we keep saying that we need to cut our coat according to our cloth. We must tighten our belt. We are acting like it's business as usual, and that's not the case. I think during the COVID pandemic, we've seen businesses cut down a lot of expenditures. We've seen them trying to tighten their belts in order to survive. I think that's something we really must do. We can't treat it as business as usual because what we are seeing from a business side is that business is being taxed extremely. Whether it's by KRA, we have different institutions coming up with different taxations. And you can imagine what this means across board, from the large to the small businesses, to the SMEs, to the Juakali sector. So we really need to figure out how we tighten our belt as a country if we're going to address these issues. And I think we still need to win the confidence of the citizens, because we can say people are ignorant, they don't know what they're talking about, but it really is a sign that the public is not confident about how we are handling this issue. So it's important that we get all hands on deck, we involve all of us, we become transparent about these conversations, because without that, the disquiet within the citizenship is not something we can ignore. So let's address the issues. Let us look at how we deal with our fiscal deficit, how we cut down our expenditure, and how we prioritize productive growth in the country, whether it's through agriculture, through the SMEs, through manufacturing, through technology, but really prioritize productive growth, because what we are seeing now is really a taxation regime that is stifling production and growth. And this is because of the issues we are talking about. So we need to fix them, because if we don't, we will really destroy our businesses and our economy. But I remain optimistic that if we all come together, as has been said, and deal with this issue and not sweep it under the rug, we'll be able to address this and have a better future for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Jaindi, I'll give you the last word, well, the last word before Angela. Your closing remarks? Hi, Jandy. You're muted, sir.
Are you hearing me? Hello? Hello? Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you now. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Folks, we are a treadmill. We are an external debt treadmill. Borrowing, forever borrowing to repay debt. Our credit ratings forever going down. We are forever engaged in negotiations for extensions. That's the life we are going to go through for, in the next few years, unless serious changes are introduced. Let's go back to a treasury single account. We have been talking about a treasury single account for many years, and let's sort out the accounting. Let's clean up the register. Let's have a debt ledger running. Let's have a proper credit ledger like accountants have. Then we'll be able to measure what we have. Right now, we won't be surprised if we have our own tuna bond. I know all of you know about the Mozambique, because there are too many. Our external debt register is cluttered with funny loans that we really need to understand and we need to be accounted for. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Just to mention that Dr. Lee gave well, he bid us farewell. He had another meeting to attend to, but he is thankful to all of you, the panelists and the attendees as well. So I will now welcome Angela to just close this out for us. Angela, welcome. Please give us your closing remarks and this out. Thank you.
I think, okay. Thank you, Walter, and thank you, everyone. We are humbled and very grateful for all the expert panelists who agreed to participate in this forum. Ours was very simple. When we did our poll on public debt, we realized that there were knowledge gaps from various quarters, but it also, the release of the poll coincided by default or design with many discussions over public debt, which we thought were critical for various stakeholders to understand. And I have learned so much sitting here, and I'm sure that many others who have attended. We had about 300 people at the beginning. We still have 150 people sitting in as we speak, meaning that there was, sustenance because the discussions were so dynamic and robust. And yes, public debt is necessary, and it is, a topic that will elicit different views. And I'm glad that those views have come out. I just want to thank everybody for having participated, both as, attendees for all the views that you have provided. Summarizing what has been said, using a quote from Ronald Reagan or paraphrasing it. It seems that we don't have a trillion shilling debt because we haven't been taxed enough. To the contrary, Kenyans are feeling overtaxed, and Honorable Musalia has mentioned that. We have a trillion shilling debt because we spend too much. Perhaps we're being too unrealistic with the way we're doing things. And certainly, as Phyllis and Wanjiru and David have mentioned, and everybody else on this panel, as a country, we need to be more responsible. So let me close off the evening by quoting from Cicero, who said, "The budget should be balanced, the treasury should be refilled, the public debt should be reduced, and the arrogance of public officials should be controlled. The assistance of foreign lands should be curtailed, lest Kenya becomes bankrupt." And we will not allow that. Thank you very much and have a blessed evening. Walter, back to you.
Thank you, Angela. So again, let me just take this opportunity to thank our panelists. Thank you very much for honoring our our invitation to be part of this. We are grateful. We thank the participants. So many questions. We've been inundated with questions. I'm sorry that we're not able to go through a lot of them, but we will try as much as possible to ask the panelists to get in touch with you and answer those questions. So thank you all very much. God bless. Take care. Stay safe. We will see you soon. Thank you.
Okay. See you, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. We've overshot a bit but not by too much. So thank you. Thank you all for your patience.
Split down the middle. This guy is secretary. The fear does, and the ones who are working with us, we even got the subcommittee using the uninformal subcommittee setup.
Was able to read. I stumbled over the newspaper and I saw a heading on the Stars paper. University of Nairobi accounts closed. Kenyatta University account closed.
Strongly so. And there are others, including this one, who don't believe him. So the right council is not really fully functional because it's split in the middle.
It would